sounds of what's happening in the main hall. Here with me, the political analyst, Dr Sithembile Mbete. Dr Mbete, good afternoon to you. I've got to tell you, from Friday morning, it was colder on Friday, a very different vibe in this main hall. On Friday, there was virtually no reaction to anything whatsoever.
Indeed, and so I think that it's perhaps indicative of some of the clarity, perhaps, and, common purpose that has emerged from the commissions. I also think that it's been very interesting to see how the president is the one who gave the report, effectively a report back on the resolutions that have been, or the recommendations rather, that have been adopted from the policy conference. We've been hearing report backs slowly from the different commissions, but the overall plenary agreements were announced by the president now, and I think that that is indicative of wanting to put out a common message, have one message coming out of the conference and one set of agreements that is taken out into the public after this conference, instead of having all of these divergent views that we've been seeing over the past few weeks.
It may also just be that the last 3 days have seen people be reminded of their commonality. They all belong to the same party. They've all got a lot at stake in 2024. Suddenly they're sort of beginning to realize, actually, we're all part of the same thing. An ANC conference can do that. I think that happened in the main hall at Mangaung, for example. And so what you're seeing is people sort of reminded of why they belong to the movement again.
Completely, but also reminded that they're facing the same crisis, right? I think that's something that's come through quite clearly, is that the ANC's reputation, the ANC's status as a liberation movement is not particularly high amongst ordinary South Africans, and a real sense of pending loss of power in the next election in 2024, and really needing to regain the trust of the majority of South Africans. So I think there's a common crisis that is being faced, which is that the ANC faces the prospect of losing power in 2024 at a national level.
You can still see, of course, what's happening in the main hall on your screen now, and we'll continue to bring you those visuals for as long as we can. Let's get to the hard politics, shall we? So this is how I captured what may be the quote of the weekend. The overall view is for the retention of the step-aside provisions to enhance the integrity of the movement and its leadership. There are strong concerns on the perceived lack of consistency in the application and implementation of this policy. Conference agreed that these must receive urgent attention so that the application of the guidelines is impartial, is fair and is consistent. That's how I captured what the president said. Is this a victory for him?
Indeed, I think that it is a victory for him. We know that particularly KwaZulu-Natal had come into the conference speaking quite loudly about scrapping the step-aside rule completely, and saying that it wasn't being applied fairly to people within the party. And so I think that retaining the step-aside rule, because it's become so associated with the president's renewal project, I think is a victory for him. It is quite bizarre, though, that at a policy conference where there are so many urgent national policy issues to discuss, that this has become the overall theme and the overall concern of the policy conference. And I think that does indicate how much the ANC's internal issues and faction fighting really impact the ability of the party to think of the policies and the issues that are facing the country more broadly.
In other words, the bit of the speech that I put in bold was this bit: nothing to do with the economy, despite 12 million people unemployed.
Exactly. Nothing to do with the economy, nothing to do with unemployment, nothing to do with this very serious infrastructure challenges that we're facing, not just electricity, but water, and all of these, the crisis that we're facing in our education system, in health. All of these have kind of, and you heard when there was the reactions to the different parts of the president's speech, the part on the step side got the most claps and reaction from the people who were listening, and the other more serious and I would say more urgent crises didn't get the same kind of response.
We're seeing on the screen now the President greeting young learners. Some of them, I think, almost overawed. Some of them, maybe not quite so overawed. You never know what you're going to get when you introduce a politician to young people. But some of them certainly, I think one or two you can see, very overawed. They're going to go home and be telling their siblings and their parents about this for quite some time. Obligatory, of course, a photograph and perhaps even a selfie or two. Sometimes you need to have this kind of thing at a political conference.
No, that young man is not interested in the official photographer. He wants to take his selfie.
He wants his own. He's got an elder brother to show up, I suspect. So we watch this play out. I was also interested, and let's just sort of see how this goes. It looks like they're finally getting their photograph. I wonder if they've got a specific joke they're going to say to all say the right thing. I think they're beginning to sing, actually. Dr. Mbete, one of the key things, of course, at the moment is electricity. And the way I captured it was, this is the President speaking now, conference endorsed the actions announced by government to fix Eskom to add new generating capacity to the grid as quickly as possible. That's pretty sort of wholehearted, isn't it? Because electricity, the provision of electricity is a very contested space within the ANC. And yet, on the President's version, and this is the President's version, it seems conference is backing him.
Completely, and I found that very interesting that there was, because part of what, a significant part of what the President announced on Monday is about privatizing part of the generation of electricity, right? And quite a significant opening up for private sector investment and private sector generation of electricity. And so to hear that that was endorsed completely and wholeheartedly is quite interesting in terms of the other views on privatization that we've heard of over the last couple of days. I do think that the Eskom issue and electricity crisis is something that the President wants to take complete control over and to lead and to have everybody else fall in line with his plans for addressing the crisis at Eskom, but also in generating new power for the grid. And so I think that this is the kind of area where, regardless of what debate will have taken place in commissions, there is one line of march. And what was also interesting here was that this was something that was said as a resolution. All of the other parts of all of the other things that have come out of the different commissions have been spoken about as recommendations that then will be discussed by branches for branches to decide on what they like, what they don't like, so that they can then take those into the national conference in December as resolutions. But on this issue of Eskom, there's no there doesn't seem to be any room for the branches to consider, to debate, to suggest something different. This is the line of march, and everyone's agreed to follow it.
I'm a little cynical. Tembekile would put it down to my age, but I would suspect that perhaps that was why the speech was on Monday night in the first place. It needed to be presented, the country needed to sort of broadly accept it, and then the point needed to be hammered home here.
Indeed, and of course this doesn't mean that people aren't going to speak out of the house, so to speak, and aren't going to keep challenging what seems to be privatization by stealth, right? But in terms of the record of the party coming out of this conference, the record officially is going to reflect that the delegates of this conference are fully behind the President's plans.
I have to say, never mind the rights and wrongs of it for a moment, I understand the President's actually beginning to walk out of the conference now as this conference comes to an end. So we are, of course, just watching that for you very closely as well. Let's just have a look at what the President is now doing as they lead out of the conference, as it brings an end to the policy conference for the ANC 2022, in a way setting the stage perhaps for the end of the year and December, going through some of the provinces. You can see the Veterans League there, the Northwest as well, and greeting delegates as part of these conversations. It has been, in some ways, a very interesting 3 days' worth of conversations. We've seen perhaps a little bit more transparency than we've seen in the past as society changes, and I think the ANC changes, but various people trying to get a minute with the President and ask him a question or two. Dr. Mbete, I do want to continue on this point because I think it may be important. Never mind the rights and wrongs of electricity, and we can all argue for a long time about it. electricity is a very technical problem and it's a very political problem. It would seem to me the right strategy. If I were the president, I would want to take charge of it too.
Yes, it is, and I think at this point it has become a problem that also threatens the national sovereign, right? So it is an issue that is placing the financial situation of the country and the fiscal position of the country at complete risk, and it is the biggest constraint we actually have to economic growth and to dealing with the issues that we have of unemployment and inequality, and so and the increasing poverty that we see. So I do think that it is unsurprising that the president would want to use all of his executive authority to take control of the addressing of this crisis. Of course, the president can't fix it on his own.
Yes.
And he does need to bring on board all of the actors that are involved in the electricity industry, including coal miners, given that two of our provinces, one in particular, rely heavily on coal for employment, for their economic sustainability. And so I'm not yet sure that, I'm not yet getting the sense that the president is bringing along all the actors in the industry, not just those that he wants to see as the future of the industry, referring here specifically to the independent power producers.
So the president's beginning to leave the conference hall. We understand he's going to do what politicians call a walkabout, and that may actually involve the media centre. The reason I say that is that it may well be that the president, in fact, will take some questions, hoping that he will. I can't say for sure that he will. I have two words that I imagine will come up in any briefing he gives. The one is parlour, and so is the other one. And I suspect that what we're likely to see is an opportunity, perhaps, for some people to put some questions to the president, but I think a lot of them will also be about the step-aside resolution and perhaps also the tone and tenor of this particular conference. Well, let's just continue going through some of the policy discussions because there's so many things to look at. I did wonder when the president had to read the resolution that they reaffirmed the resolution that the Reserve Bank must be nationalised, if there was a little bit of gritted teeth on his side.
There was, and there was a lot of hedging, right?
Yes.
I mean, he said it's affirmed that, and the terminology that he used today and that Kenneth Creamer actually used yesterday in the report back of the Economic Transformation Commission was to address the historical anomaly.
Yes.
Or to fix the historical anomaly of private ownership of the Reserve Bank. But then, of course, what the president said today is that this should be done, it should be fully owned by the people, but to do it in a manner that is aware of the costs to the fiscus and all of the other considerations in terms of economic policy. And so really a kicking to touch on this particular issue in the same way that that has been done actually for
years.
Years and years and years. I mean, you heard even with the Minister of Finance when he was speaking to you earlier, saying that nationalization has been a buzzword for the ANC since 1955. And so we need to be aware of the costs of nationalizing the Reserve Bank and be able to communicate that to our people. So something that it almost feels like a routine resolution that needs to be said. But that the ANC in government is not prioritizing at all because it's the people in charge, I don't think, want to do it.
So the same problem. The Sechachniako is probably going to sleep well apart from all the other problems the poor man faces. It's also interesting because I talk about nationalising the Reserve Bank, but it seems to me one of the big political stories, if you look at the sort of interface between the economy, the political economy of the country, politics and the economy, is actually privatisation. SAA has been sold. You know, it's now 51% owned by a private company. There's now going to be more private sector participation in Eskom than ever before in terms of generating electricity. So, I mean, that is one of the big stories, isn't it? The trend towards some kind of privatisation. I won't say privatisation, I'll say a bigger role for the private sector in supplying things the state used to supply.
Yes, completely. And what was interesting in the Economic Transformation Commission report back yesterday was that you didn't get the sense that there'd been a philosophical or a discussion on principle. So there was a discussion on particular issues, Eskom in particular, but the idea that, an overall agreement on, well, how much of the role do we see the private sector playing in the provision of public goods? How much of a role do we want to see the private sector playing in the development of skills, for example, or in employment? That kind of discussion as a principled discussion on that doesn't seem to have been taken place. It was rather speaking around the involvement of the private sector in particular areas and in particular sectors. So it's still not clear to me at the end of this policy conference how much there is an awareness, a deliberateness from the party side in the move towards privatization that we are seeing. Is this something that just the government is doing and using, the president and his cabinet and other government officials using their government power to be able to do this? Or is this something that is endorsed and that is backed by the ANC as a party, and does then it reflect a party policy? It doesn't seem that there was much discussion on this matter as a general principle and not just in relation to certain sectors.
This is the last policy conference between the 2024 election. There will obviously be the December conference, and a lot can change between now and then, and may in fact do so. You would think just the raw politics of this moment would suggest that a policy conference would come out very strongly for a basic income grant, because the raw politics of the matter is that that would win votes, or could be used to win votes, let me put it like that. And yet I'm not seeing that. The Finance Minister, Nkorankwana, was very careful not to oppose it directly, but sort of raising other options. In other words, a sort of softer line of what he said before. We haven't seen a sort of big call for it. I'm slightly surprised by that.
You know what was very noticeable for me yesterday was that when the Economic Transformation Commission report was being given and the question on the basic income grant was raised, the response was, well, that's something that's being discussed in social transformation. And then, of course, as we know, when the social transformation report was happening, most of that actually was concerned with issues around women's rights and gender-based violence. And so there was nothing really about the basic income grant that came out of the social transformation report. And then, of course, today, the finance minister, in his response to you, also said, well, that's something to be dealt with in social transformation. And I think that in its own is significant, that the party is seeing this as an issue of social development, as a grant, as a welfare concern, and not as an economic concern. Firstly, so it's not being seen as a way to, because of course the finance minister, as he was speaking to you, spoke about needing to think of ways to stimulate the economy and what are the levers for economic stimulus. And the basic income grant is not being thought of as a lever for economic stimulus. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it is clearly being thought of as something exceptional in the sense that it needs...
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry, Dr. Mbete. We'll, of course, have more analysis from you in just a moment.